Professor Skinner, we're here today to talk about verbal behavior, the book by that name and the behavior of that name. Your book, Verbal Behavior, in which you set forth a behavioral account of language, strikes me as one of the great theoretical works of 20th century science. Certainly the most important treatise on mind since the great British empirical philosophers, Locke and the rest, had their say on the topic. Do you object to my calling verbal behavior a treatise on mind and human understanding, terms borrowed from philosophy?
I don't think so. It certainly is a book about how we talk about behavior and our own behavior. And the concept of mind could never have arisen until we reached the point at which we talked about what we were doing. As I can't imagine that pre-verbal human organisms or any other species in the world ever asked itself, why did I do that? You do things, and if successful, you do them again. If not, you don't do them again, and so on. But under what conditions could you ever say to yourself, why did I do that? It's got to be verbal. You've got to start talking about yourself and others. Now, the first answer to that question, I think, must have come from noticing something inside your body as you were behaving. Oh, I must have done that because of the way I felt. I think it was only, my guess is it would be when histories began to be written that you began to see sequences of events in which something else might explain the behavior, namely something that already happened. And that would explain the feelings that you have, what you're feeling in your body, and hence the behavior. But I think it's only because we do talk about behavior that we understand what we call our mind. And that means that verbal behavior must have come before we had a mind, if there is such a thing, before we spoke about how we feel, why we did things, what our states of mind were, what our thoughts were, and so on. Those are verbal constructs. Mm-hmm. But behavior is quite something else. It's what we do in the world as a result of genetic and personal history, what has happened to the species and what has happened to us as individuals.
Well, near the end of verbal behavior, you have the statement, which I found startling the first dozen times I read it. I'm paraphrasing, but it goes something like, thinking is behaving, as though they were really just two names for the same process.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I am what the philosophers would call a monist, in the sense that I believe that I am nothing but a member of a particular evolved species, and nothing of any other kind of thing exists in me. I've got to explain everything I do in terms of what will eventually come down to biochemical changes, and the people in the nervous system will get on to those better. But up to beyond that, I can only suppose that I do things in the sense of acting upon the world, and only when that world has certain features at a given time because of what has happened to me. Now, if I see you, I'm just seeing you but not doing anything more. I've just stopped talking for a bit and I'll just sit there seeing you. Well, what is that except what is happening in my head when you are stimulating my eyes in a particular way? Now, if I were studying you as a pure sensation, a spot of red or something like that, I would probably trace it to genetics, what is going on in the eye that leads me to see red. But since you're very much more than that, I would have to explain what I now see in terms of what has happened to me in the past many hundreds of times as I've talked with you. That is the difference between perception and a sensation. But it's all still what I am doing because of my genetic endowment, my eyes, and nerve systems, and so on, and my past history. Now, I can close my eyes, and I'm still seeing you. I'm not doing it very well. I do it much better with my eyes open, but I still do it, and what I am doing is what I am doing with my eyes open. It's the same activity in my nervous system. I have no information about that. And a long time in the future, the physiologist will have a very clear picture of what it is. But it is something that I do, and I've done it because it was very important for a member of a species in the past to see things and get out of the way or eat them up, whatever the case was. And therefore, for individuals to do the same things, thanks to a different process of selection, namely operant conditioning. It's part of my activity, and in the very broadest sense, that is what behaving is, doing what I am doing.
Well, a common view in psychology, not our view, I think, is that the true subject matter of psychology is some inner process of thought that lies behind behavior. And behavior is often thought of as a mere symptom, almost a trivial byproduct of this inner thinking process. What do you make then of that inner-outer distinction?
Well, I think the reason that we now question the inner thing, the reason there's been a behavioristic revolution, is that we now know more about the behavior. Up until 1913, at least, no one seriously said that you can forget about these internal things and look at the behavior. But that was only possible because people had begun to study behavior. Now, behaviorism didn't amount to much for 25 years because we didn't know much about it, about what people do. The rats ran through mazes, and dogs salivated the bells and whatnot. But there was no real science of the behavioral antecedents of behavior, of the environmental antecedents of behavior. Once they had been discovered and very carefully worked out, there was something else to explain what we do in addition to what we're feeling. And then you realize that once you have a science of behavior which establishes the role of the environment, two sciences really, ethology, the role of natural selection, and experimental analysis of behavior is the role of the environment of the individual through operant conditioning. Once you have that science, then there's less need to look inside for a cause, and eventually you can simply say there's no need at all, because what is inside is the product of the history. So that what happens is, as I grew up as a baby and a child and an adult, was that my body was slowly changed by contingency to reinforcement. It remained a body produced by natural selection. And that as soon as we understand the environmental sources of what I do all the way along, we don't need to bother about how it feels when I'm doing it. But what philosophers have done for 2,500 years at least is to try to look more and more closely at what they feel or what they see introspectively. And of course, they never have got anywhere. And Plato is still taught today in departments of philosophy, you see, 2,500 years later. And moreover, the cognitive psychology has given up on introspection. The psychology in general has. Do you find a psychologist sitting around observing mental life anymore? No. The cognitive processes are inferences, which you establish by hypotheses and inferences and so on. I don't know of a single psychologist who sits around and watches a stream of consciousness or is a trained observer in the Wundtian tradition, though the behavioristic attack on introspection has been totally successful. Introspection is now out as a process of science. It's still there with philosophy, and they can have it, and they will. But the good philosophers, I would say someone like Bertrand Russell, I think, realizes that you can't get much out of introspection, although it's interesting to look at yourself when you're thinking, but you've got eventually to get back to physical explanation.
You say look at yourself when you're thinking. I mean, you, I think, of all people in psychology, have been a paragon of what can be accomplished, what one can accomplish with themselves when they look at themselves. I mean, you are always, it seems to me, analyzing your own behavior and trying to plan your environment to get maximum production and enjoyment out of your life.
Well, yes, because it's not that I want to find out how to think better. I find out under what conditions do I think better. And that's very different. What is left to me at 84 is very little, except to go on with what I've done. The thing I enjoy most is thinking. When I'm at my desk, when I'm not eating too much or too tired talking to people and so on, at my desk, I'm never happier. It is just a wonderful state to be in, especially when the sentences do come out and so on and so on. Now, I don't do that by screwing up my courage at the sticking place and think. I arrange my personal history for the preceding 24 hours to get that state. And of course, I have to look at the state. I watch myself. I see myself saying things. This is what I learned to do as a member of a species which specializes in self-observation. And I don't question the importance of this. I would advise therapists to be behavior therapists, not psychotherapists, to change the world in which people live, not their minds or their feelings. But I would say, for heaven's sake, ask people how they feel. Ask people what they're going to do or what their intentions are. That's the best way you can get information about their history. But you're not getting at the initial cause. And I am not changing the initial causes in my behavior. I'm changing the external causes, which cause me to be in a state when I am most productive as a thinker.
Well, okay. What do you mean then by thinking? Let's come back to that question of thinking and behaving. What is the kind of thing? What do you mean by the thinking that you do?
Well, there's a whole difference between the cognitive idea that when I'm there, I'm retrieving something, retrieving thoughts, like remembering a name. Do you retrieve a name from memory? I don't think so at all. When you go through the alphabet to prompt yourself, you work to get the name to come. But you don't go like in a filing cabinet and pull it out, or go dial a computer and have it appear on the screen. You don't retrieve. The whole idea that retrieving information that the cognitive psychologist talks about is ridiculous. We don't retrieve. We try to create conditions in which something happens. And when I'm writing a paper, I have an outline, a topic, and I have a lot of other things all arranged in a useful file and so on. I do everything I can to get that next sentence out. But I don't compose it. I don't search for it. I don't retrieve it from some mess of memories or anything like that.
Then are you not responsible for your own thinking?
Well, of course not. No, we're not responsible for anything we do, except in the ethical sense that we have been taught by our culture to take steps so that we don't do certain kinds of things. And if we haven't taken those steps, we are held responsible. I would hold them responsible for not teaching us to take them, but that's another matter. In the long run, I think behavior is simply what various complicated biochemical systems do under certain circumstances. And I don't think a biochemical system acts in order to achieve a goal. It acts in certain ways and with a given result.
Well, that brings me to another question I wanted to ask you about. About midway through verbal behavior, there is a statement that for me has always summed up one of the book's chief lessons. I'm paraphrasing again, but it roughly goes, the speaker is a locus where variables come together to produce their effect. I don't think anybody else in the world has ever talked about a speaker as a locus. What do you mean by that odd turn of phrase?
Well, precisely what I've just said. When I say something, I'm saying it right now. I wouldn't be saying it if I were a chimpanzee. The history of the human species is all here, helping me do this. That's not me, though. I am a product of that. And if anything starts because of my genetics. It starts because of my genetics and not because of me. Now, what I say also is the product of an enormously long history of things I've read, things I've heard, things I've said, things I've done, and so on. They have changed me, changed that genetic endowment in such a way that I am answering your questions in the way I am. But that isn't anything starting within me either. If I had not known about the role of contingencies of reinforcement or natural selection, I would have had to suppose that things originated in me, and that was the case prior to Darwin and behaviorism. But having then seen how selection by consequences will produce the body that I have here when at birth, or slightly before perhaps, and how the process of operant conditioning, which is an evolved process, has changed that body throughout my lifetime so that it behaves this way, there's nothing left in there of a B.F. Skinner saying anything. I am that person saying this now, but I am not originating. I am a place in which a genetic and a personal history have come together to produce what I'm saying. But I am a locus, and I feel no, it doesn't seem to threaten me at all. I don't feel robbed of any dignity by putting it that way.
Why do you think so many people do feel robbed? If you tell, I find with undergraduates, if you try to teach the doctrine that you've just been explaining, they resent it, and they feel that their freedom, that their joy in life, their purpose for being has been taken away from them.
Well, it all depends on what's taken away. A juvenile delinquent is all too happy to have you say, well, I feel sorry for you, really, you shouldn't be punished because you had a bad background, you grew up in a bad place and so on, and your father neglected you and your mother was off on the town or something. That's why you're a delinquent, and we'll have to forgive you. It's not your fault. But now supposing you're talking to a very good basketball player, and you're saying, you really are very good, but remember, you're 6'7" tall, you had a wonderful coach in high school, you got a scholarship for college, and were able to play, you know, year after year after year, and then you got, you're getting a huge salary now and can devote your life to playing. That's why you're a good player. Oh no, I am a good player. You say, well, you won't say I'm delinquent, but by God, you're not going to be robbed of your reputation as a great player. I think there's something inconsistent there, and I think the way to straighten it out is either to hold everyone responsible for what they do and give everyone credit for what they do. And I don't think we're willing to do that. And I would prefer the other, and I think I think it's good to be proud of what you've done. It's good to be ashamed of what you've done. These are cultural practices which have got you to do things. I would praise people, even though I don't think what I'm praising is anything more than something that will be changed by my praise. I will be, if you say great, then that's more likely to be done next time. You say, if you say great, then that's more likely to be done next time.
You know, almost any school of psychotherapy or behavior therapy or religion or philosophy that I know of emphasizes saying to people, you have choices. Today is the beginning, is the first day of the rest of your life. You have choices. You can choose where you're going to go with your life from here. Do you think that there's any sense in which people do have choices?
Well, there are situations in which there are different things that can be done, and one of them will be done, and you call that a choice. Now, you can also do something called decision-making, which is to work on yourself or the setting so that one thing or the other is done. You're stuck between two things, like Balaam's ass, and you've got to do something to do one or the other, or you'll die. And so you fiddle around with this bag, this one over here looks better, I like to go, I'm right-handed, I'll go to the right, or you'll do something that gets you to respond. And you say, I decided what to do and I made my choice. But these are entirely determined by environmental events. So the correlate of what you're saying, though, is that people don't want to injure a belief in choice, and so they turn to ineffective methods. Teachers don't want to teach because that injures the students' creative learning. This goes way back, Comenius, back 300 or 400 years ago. The more the teacher teaches, the less the student learns. But you want students to learn, so you mustn't teach. That's Carl Rogers said as much as that. In his own field, he said as much as that, too. You want the individual, the client, to be the one who will come up with a solution. If you give him the solution, you've robbed him of the ability to find it for himself. This is true of all claims for creativity and so on. If you show an influence, oh yes, he was influenced by so, then you've robbed him of some originality. You see, we try so hard to keep that imagined inner entity or ego working in a given way. I mean, we don't want to take credit away, and my book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, was a demonstration of how much damage that has done to our cultures.
How do you explain the fact that people don't do what they're told to do? They have to, in some sense, find their own solution.
Oh, well, first of all, make the distinction between rule-governed and contingency-shaped behavior. Teachers construct situations in which students do things for irrelevant reasons because later on they will do them and get good reasons to follow. So that it's a matter really of priming the behavior which is then truly taken over. Now, that can be done in a school, and if the school builds up behavior which does pay off in the world at large, it's a good school. And so you teach people to analyze situations, describe them, extract from them rules to follow, then the consequences follow too, and from that point on, you have originated something in the sense that you have got yourself to do something that did pay off. But how many people know how to find rules from the contingencies they face? So that should be taught. But it's not teaching creativity, it's teaching the manipulation of a world verbally, which then leads to action, which is then followed by consequences. So you always come out with a behavior followed by consequences, or you haven't got anywhere. If you're just following rules is nothing. When you don't like to follow rules, I don't like to follow rules. But if somebody tells me to do something and I do it and consequences follow, I may even say thank you for telling me.
I think this is a crucial topic in current behavioral thinking and research and theorizing, so I'd like to spend a little more time on it. What do you mean by a rule? You've introduced the distinction between rule-governed and contingency-shaped behavior.
Once you can talk about behavior, or talk about the world, you can help other people come into effective contact with the world. And with the origin of verbal behavior in the human species only, enormous advances were made because it was no longer up to the individual to learn everything through what happens to him as an individual or her. And you get then a culture forming which primes behavior, models behavior, gets the behavior out so that things can happen that have happened in the first place only rarely to one person and now happen to everyone. Somebody first discovered something about something. That would have been the end, and it might have been a very difficult contingency that taught it. If it hadn't been put down and transferred as a rule in texts or passed down by rules verbally and so on, what has happened to our what is called a culture is that there has evolved an enormous source of rules which, if you follow, will lead you to do things that will be reinforced. Science does that too. Science is nothing but a complex set of rules of action. Governments have rules which get you to do what they won't punish you for doing. Religions have rules of the same kinds of things. In business, you've got all of the prices and all of these kinds of things, which are agreements, verbal agreements as to what is going to happen, what you will get if you pay so much, and so on. It's all rule-governed behavior. And cognitive psychologists have taken it over now. They study how people follow rules, but not with the contingencies showing. But you only follow rules for good reasons. That would be that you have to be, your behavior of following rules must have been reinforced somehow or other. And that gets you into a difference between the behavior which is contingency shaped, and that's the real behavior. That's when you're doing things because consequences have followed when you've done it. And following rules, which is temporary. You follow the rule, and then the consequences follow when you're there. If you come to Cambridge and say, I like good Italian food, and I say, well, go to Luigi's, very good food. That's advice, that's a rule. It's a description of what will happen if you go to Luigi's. You go and get good food, and from that point on, if you go again, it's not because of the rule at all, it's because of the food you got. And that's all of science is that. Somebody discovers that you do it this way and something will happen. Very unusual, very rare contingencies, but accidental. But after that, it's no longer accidental. Now you do it because of the rules. It's all in my book on verbal behavior, but I didn't get it out quite that far.
Mm-hmm. I think you've also talked about it at other times. Book learning versus practical behavior.
Yes, well, there's an old distinction between knowledge by description and knowledge by experience. That's it. Knowledge by description is rule-governed knowledge. Mm-hmm. You do things because the consequences have been described, mm-hmm. and that's what cognitive science, the cognition in cognitive science is knowledge by description. They describe settings, what would you do, and so on. Mm-hmm. But knowledge by experience is operant conditioning. That's what changes take place in an organism when contingencies have been imposed mm-hmm. to produce it, mm-hmm. produce the behavior.
We've all seen kids so commonly, and I've occasionally seen it in my adult friends as well, where you start to show them how to do something, and they say, don't do it for me, I'll do it myself.
Yes, exactly.
Why?
Well, because they would prefer, it's more fun to be contingency shaped than to follow rules. Think of how much we tell kids to do. If you clean your teeth this morning, go clean your teeth. Now sit down. Don't wash your hands and so on. We boss them around where no good contingencies do follow. Teeth wasn't bothering him at the moment, or the hands weren't interfering with eating and all of this. So that we have a burden of just too many rules which are followed with nothing else happening to reinforce following them. And so we attack those who give us the rules.
I've been supplying you with prompts for your verbal behavior, but there must be things that you would like to share with us that I have failed to prompt. So what else would you like to tell us about that has to do with verbal behavior?
Well, I suppose if you allowed me, I would get around to my battle with the cognitive psychologist, because it is essentially verbal. It's concerning verbal behavior. They have given up on behavior as a function of the setting and what has happened in the past to talk about verbal behavior. You describe settings and you ask them to say what they would expect to happen, what they would intend to do, and so on. Now, I think that's moving right into the field of verbal behavior and forgetting all about what the operant people study, which is real situations and real behavior. And that reminds me now, they're giving me a free rein here, of another very important point. Many people, especially the animal activists now, are saying, you can do all of these experiments with human beings, why do you have to use animals? My answer to that is absolutely the opposite. You can't do these experiments with human beings. You must do them with animals or with nonverbal human beings, of which you don't have many, unless you work with very small children or very atypical people. And the reason is a situation in which people find themselves. And what happens then is that they analyze the situations and begin to say something about it. Mm-hmm. And they may give themselves rules to follow. Mm-hmm. And then what they do from that point on is a response to the setting you have created and to the rules they have created for themselves. So that the only research on human subjects that I think feasible is precisely that point of what people do in analyzing situations and giving themselves rules which modify their contingency-shaped behavior. And I think it's all the basic behavioral processes are all available in the animal laboratory, all of them. And let's say I've used nothing but those processes in my book on verbal behavior. That is where you study it. That is where you study how the brain works, if you want to put it that way, or how the organism as a whole works, as I want to put it. And given that, you can then interpret what's going on in daily life, both in terms of the contingencies which prevail as such, or the contingencies which generate verbal behavior and responses to the products of verbal behavior. I think it's a very important point. Only the animal laboratory, really, can get down to the basic processes of behavior. I put that true, and I would say that was true of perception, too. I think the work that's been done, Herrnstein's work on pattern discrimination and what he calls concept formation, I wouldn't call it that. I think the concept's in the apparatus, not in the pigeon. But that is a much more precise study of how behavior is brought under the control of stimuli than to bring people into a setting and try to convert them into, as the old Wundtians did, into the skilled observer who didn't take the stimulus into account. That was a stimulus error. If you take what you remember about stimuli, you'll spoil the research. Of course, the perception people came along and did that too, and what you perceive, the way you perceive something is not the way it is, but the way it seems to you, and all that means is not the way it is, but the way it is plus all of this happened to you in similar situations throughout your life. That is why you respond to it as a perception instead of, but I think you only can get back to the basic processes only with nonverbal organisms. And that's
basic in the sense of not contaminated by...
Not being contaminated by talking about it or having been influenced by what was said to you and so on.
But you're not suggesting that it isn't worthwhile once you understand the basic processes, or as you're studying the basic processes, it's worthwhile to also study how people make use of verbal behavior.
Oh, well, you teach verbal behavior, yes, and you teach them to follow instructions, you teach them to respond to descriptions of contingencies. We do this with children all the time. And we could do it much better than we do in schools if we recognize the nature of the problem.
You call it rules, other people might call some of what you've talked about self-fulfilling prophecy. Once you've said that something, then you do it that way because you've said so.
Well, that would be an example. I don't like the word rules, but what I really mean is verbal behavior controlled behavior, but that's a little awkward. And I'm settling for rules just as a standard term.
There's a whole field of psychological research on what's called problem solving or concept formation. You know, people are shown cards with curly lines or straight lines and red borders or blue borders and so on. And what people do in trying to identify the critical features of the stimuli is often called hypothesis making.
Yes.
How would you talk about that?
Well, a hypothesis is something supposed to be inside, and I object to that, absolutely. I think The old word association is a good example. Is a very simple example. Pavlov's dogs associated the bell with the food. Not at all. Pavlov associated them. Associate means to put together. And it was Pavlov who did that. The interesting thing is that having associated the bell with the food, the dog begins to respond to the bell. Now that is not association by the dog, it's associated by Pavlov. The same thing is true of concept formation. The various Ernstein's experiment, very fascinating experiment. You show a pigeon hundreds of slides, in some of which there are people, and in others not. And in a surprising short time, the pigeons will respond in one way to a slide with a person in it, and another way to a slide without. Now, it's a mistake to say, though, I think, that the pigeon has acquired the concept of person. The concept is in the apparatus. The concept was formed when you reinforced responses to slides with people and extinguished responses to slides without people. You formed the concept. The remarkable thing is that pigeons can respond in that different way, but without having a concept in the head to help them.
Well, is that true of people as well then? I mean, in what sense, when should we apply the word concept? When can we say, if ever, that people have concepts or that a pigeon has a concept?
Yeah. Well, concept is the process, is the product of conception. And that is a metaphor that is really relevant here. Something is supposed to have happened in you for the first time. And it's like all mentalistic concepts. There are environmental explanations which take over the origination of something inside. It was the environment, it was the contingency, the reinforcement, which led to the behavior. And a concept is something we make up as a name for the change in us, which, as a result of which, we now behave in a different way. You see, we don't store memories, we simply are changed organisms. We don't acquire concepts, we are changed organisms. The pigeon that will respond to people and not to people is a changed pigeon. And we've changed it by differential reinforcement with respect to visual presentations. It's there is, of course, a change that will eventually be discovered by brain scientists 100 years from now, perhaps, when they get to that fineness of control. And that I leave it to them. I believe in brain science. I don't believe in philosophy or concept formation.
I guess I'm still curious to pursue thinking a little more. I have two questions. Is there a difference between verbal thinking and nonverbal thinking? And is there a difference between human thinking and the thinking of other species?
Well, since I have no way of knowing about the thinking of other species as something they observe, and I can both observe what I do and also what I am thinking at the time, I'm not quite sure how that could be answered. However, I would distinguish between the way I am thinking when I am inventing a piece of apparatus as a gadget, and I do things without actually doing them. In a sense, I almost always as visualizing the consequences of doing. I see myself putting things together in certain ways and seeing whether that's square and whether this is likely to move without hitting this and so on. And all of that is perceptual behavior, which is very hard to make people understand as behavior. But it is what I would do if I had the pieces there, and what I would see if I saw if I were doing it with the pieces. And of course I can't do it as well without the pieces. That's why I would eventually get around to making a model to see whether it works or not. I invented a very complex machine, the teaching machine, in the middle 50s. It's now in the Smithsonian. It is full of gadgetry of all kinds. I drew all of the parts for the construction of that one summer in Maine with nothing but squared paper available. Every single part in there, dimensions, exact specifications, and so on. It took a machinist a full year to make the parts and put them together. With very slight adjustments, it worked. Now, that's the thing, I love doing that. If I had had a shop on Monhegan, a machine shop working with metal and so on, I would have made it instead of drawing lines and visualizing the parts. But I was doing things in both cases. The fact that nobody could see me when I was just drawing lines and they couldn't see what I was seeing, these drawings didn't look at all like the parts when they were finally made. Nevertheless, it was a kind of behavior. Behavior I've always enjoyed doing and done well enough so I get a lot of reinforcement out of it. Some people might find it impossible to do, I dare say. But there are lots of things I can't do too. I can't think music except when I'm hearing it. I discovered that I used to play piano and I had an electric organ too. But I couldn't read Mozart's sonata and hear it. Like sit down and play it and hear it. But I discovered that if I turned off the sound of my electric organ and played it, I could hear it.
Oh, really?
The movement of my hands brought me auditory behavior that worked very well.
Well, you can imagine then how in a professional musician the behavior could be shaped of looking at the notes on the printed page and hearing the music.
Oh, yes, or how, because Beethoven wrote the Ninth Symphony totally deaf. He never heard it. And he may have heard some deep vibrations of some kind, but yet he composed it, I'm sure, but it was hearing it as he composed it. But he never heard it through his ears.
Mm-hmm. You describe with great delight the way your enjoyment at working with your hands in a shop. I think there are psychologists who would say that shows up in your particular science of behavior, that it has a kind of mechanical flavor. Do you think that your own personal enjoyment at gadgetry and making practical things that work, and that had to have preceded your ever coming into psychology, did that influence the way the science of operant behavior developed?
Well, it influenced the way research was carried out because I could throw an apparatus together in very little time. If it wasn't working, I could change it. If I ran into something else, I could scrap it and build something else quickly and so on. So I didn't have to call in a machinist and have him do something so I could do some research. And certainly all of that early stuff was just junk that I put together with an extraordinary number of lucky accidents as a result. The most obvious one, I made a dispenser of food pellets for a rat by taking an old disc of food I found in a junk pile, a circular piece of wood, and drilled holes, and I arranged it so this would step along and drop one piece out every time. It just happened there was a spindle on that piece of wood, and I left it on. And then it occurred to me after I began to get records of how fast the animal was working for food, with marks like this, and it occurred to me if I put a string around that spindle, I could have the pen drop and get a curve. Well, now that is extraordinary luck, because it is the curve from which the slope is a measure of probability or rate of responding. It proved to be so, certainly in my own thinking, very important. Well, that's gadgetry. It is due to my building things. If I were sitting around, like Wittgenstein's, playing with words or whatever he played with, it would be a very different thing, of course. Wittgenstein did say at one point, you know, that it will take some animal research to answer these questions. I value that. things I saw. And with old woes, new whale, my dear time's waste. Then can I
When you were saying that there is not much use in teaching all those years of Latin to little kids, I was thinking that a grammar school system that produced Shakespeare can't be all wrong.